right. Okay. Hi, everybody. So as Dr. Kanat said, my name is Ginger Nickerson, and I'm going to be talking with you today about how I have in my career path used qualitative research to look at natural resource issues. And I'm, as his slide said, that I'm currently work for UVM Extension in forest pest education. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about using qualitative research and all of sort of the different ways that that can be applied and my career path for getting there. So when Dr. Kanat contacted me, I knew that I wanted to share with you three things. I wanted to talk about my career path, which was pretty twisty and turny. And I feel like that's an important story to share because not everyone's career path is straight and narrow from A to Z. A lot of times it takes twists and turns. And let me know if anybody can't hear me, just raise your hand or tap your ear. I wanted to talk to you about qualitative research because that's what I'm really passionate about. That's the work that I do that I love the most. It's what makes me want to get up in the morning and it makes me really happy. It's also, I think if you're interested in environmental science, in natural resource management, in health issues, it's a really important research approach to know about and have, because in those fields, we're often interested in changing people's behavior. And in order to change people's behavior, you first have to know why they think they're doing what they're doing. And that's one of the things that qualitative research can help us do. It can help us understand why people are doing things or why they think they're doing things. And then, so I'll give you a few, just sort of like a quick taste of some of the different projects that I've used using qualitative research on natural resource issues. And then I'll spend the majority of the talk talking about a current project that I'm involved in that I'm really excited about. It has nothing to do with my work on forest pests. It's totally separate. But I'm doing oral histories with people who collect, people who work in the solid waste industry. So garbage truck drivers, composters, those types of folks. So that's going to be where I'm going to do kind of a little bit more of a deep dive on an example of how you can use qualitative research. So, but before I talk about me, this is a blank slide because I was hoping to use this polling app so that we could have a little bit more of a two-way conversation. But I could not make it work. But I do want to learn about you. So just using the old-fashioned method of raising your hands, could you tell me how many of you are, let's see if I can even get it. No, it's not going to do it. Okay, so how many of you are biology? Well, you don't have to have declared your major, but just if that's an area you think you may go into. So biology. Okay, a lot of you. Health, is that a major here? Okay. Looks like some of you might be double dipping. Environmental science. And what else? Is there anything else that I'm missing? Other? Okay, and do we have other? We've got another. Okay, and you're probably familiar with the differences between basic and applied research, that in general, just in a really simple way of describing it, basic research is when we're trying to just understand how things work, how the universe and all of its components work. Applied research is when we're taking that basic research, what we've learned about human biology or cancer or physics, and we're applying it to a practical and immediate problem. So how to solve cancer, or how to build nuclear instruments. And then again, so going back, so how many of you have a bias or more of an interest in basic research? Okay, cool. And how many of you are interested in applied research? Okay. So qualitative research can be used in both fields, both in basic and in applied. It tends to be used more in basic in social sciences, but it's very useful for applied sciences. So that's a little bit faded, but that's a head there. And these are representing statistical analysis. But just at the very simplest level, the difference, we can define qualitative research as research where the findings are developed through investigation that's not relying on numbers and statistical analysis. So I'll get into the details of that more in the section on qualitative research, but it's everything other than numbers. So, and a lot of times that tends to be narrative or, people explaining things, using words, whether it's text or verbally. So this is another one of those polling things. And I'm just curious, how many of you have already done some kind of qualitative research, either in a class or in high school or for a job or an internship? It could be interviews or oral histories, content analysis. Okay, so a fair number of you have. And of those of you who've done qualitative research, did you feel like you learned, how many of you felt like you learned something new in that process? Okay, so about the same number who had participated in it. Okay, so now I'm going to start to talk about my career path. And I'm going to have a drink of water. So when I was in 4th grade, I read this book called There's a Seal in My Sleeping Bag. And this was about a guy he was a wildlife biologist, and he lived in British Columbia, and he traveled all over the world studying animals. And I really loved the outdoors, and I thought, okay, this is great. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to become a wildlife biologist. And I grew up during the 1970s when the environmental movement was very strong, and I was very influenced by that. So the other kind of motivating factor for me, I wanted to be outdoors, and I wanted to save the earth. One of the things that I had going for me is that my mind naturally works like a spider web. I see connections every place. And so I ended up going into ecology, and ecology is really about relationships and connections between things. So having a mind like a spider web helped me in that aspect of ecology. But I also have dyscalculia. And if you haven't heard of dyscalculia, it's like dyslexia, but just like people who have dyslexia have a hard time making sense of numbers, I had a really hard time making sense of other way around. People with dyslexia have a hard time making sense of letters. I have a hard time making sense of numbers. So although I was in advanced placement biology and all of these other higher level classes except for math, my chemistry teacher said, Nickerson, you becoming a biologist is going to be like getting a camel through the eye of a needle, because there's going to have to be a lot of statistics and a lot of math in that. Well, at the time, that just made me more determined, and I dug in and I said, I'm going to do this. And I ended up becoming a plant community ecologist. I started out in wildlife biology, discovered that I did not have the patience to sit around and wait for animals to do their thing. So I went into plant community ecology, where you can, the plants are always there, sitting there waiting for you to measure them and watch them. And this worked really well for my temperament. I was an introvert and I loved being outdoors, so it was quiet. But it didn't feed the part of me that wanted to save the earth. It didn't feed the part of me that was like, this is why I'm getting up in the morning to try to go to work. Because I was sitting there and I was thinking, at this time, I was doing restoration ecology, and that's how I was applying the plant community ecology. And in restoration ecology, if you're not familiar with it, what you're doing is taking degraded habitats and trying to figure out how to return them to health. And I felt like, the scientific questions around restoration ecology are actually relatively simple in comparison to the social and political and economic questions. So, I was living and going to school in Wisconsin at the time, and we had all of these wetlands and wildlands that were being developed and turned into malls. And so, I thought, that's what I want to work on. I want to try to figure out why we're degrading habitats in the first place. Because the scientific questions about how to recreate them are not as hard as the human and social questions around environmental degradation. So I was really lucky. I got a gig working with an organization called Community Conservation Consultants, and they were working on ecotourism projects in Central America. And I got a job working at this place called Bermudian Landing, which was one of the first ecotourism sites around. And they were conserving habitat for howler monkeys, which they called baboons there. And what I was doing, I was also very interested in ethnobotany, in how people use plants. So what I was doing for the community conservation consultants is I was interviewing older men and some women, but mostly older men, who had worked in the chicle and mahogany industries when they were younger, asking them how they used plants. And what we were going to do with that information was turn it into interpretive exhibits in a natural history museum that would be used in this community where they were bringing in tourists to try to create economic development in the community that was based on conservation. So I had a fabulous time sitting around all day talking to these old men and women about what it was like when they used to work in the forest, and what did they use, how did they make things out of the plants. And I heard them tell me all of these stories about how the diversity and abundance of species in the forests and in the fisheries were so much greater in the old days. And they had an analysis as to why the diversity and the abundance had gone down, whether it was because the citrus plantations had come in and now they had this monoculture where they used to have a forest, or they had big-time fishermen doing different, this guy, you can't see it very well, he's doing a cast net for small-scale fisheries, or if it was other types of fishing that were coming in and decimating the fishing. And I'd spend my off time hanging out with the kids, and I don't have pictures of older teenagers, but I hung out a lot with the older teenagers. And they had heard some of the adult stories, but they hadn't heard so much the analysis as why things had changed. And I thought, that's interesting. But that was kind of all I, as far as I went with it. So then I went to graduate school, and I got my master's at the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources. And this is actually 2 years ago. We had a reunion. I'm right there. So we're all a lot older than we were when I went to grad school. But I went with the intention, when I went to my master's program, I said, okay, I want to work in the tropics. I want to study, I'm really interested in biodiversity and how can we increase biodiversity in managed systems. So I wanted to work on farms and do agroforestry and combine my love of ethnobotany and increasing diversity in traditional agriculture. But a funny thing happens on the way when you're in school. Often you get introduced to ideas that you weren't expecting to get introduced to. So I had this professor, my advisor, John Vandermeer. He's an agricultural ecologist. And I ended up taking a lot of classes, spending a lot of time in his world. And he was very interested in sort of the political aspect of research, particularly conservation biology. How does it impact the communities that we're working in? What kinds of obligations do we have to the people in the communities that we're working in? Who's benefiting from the research? So those were the questions that we were asking in our lab meetings all the time. And one of the people in this group was really interested in this thing called participatory action research. And participatory action research can be either quantitative, using numbers, or qualitative, using everything other than numbers to understand a phenomena. But the point to participatory action research is that engages the people who are affected by the problem, are engaged in in defining what we want to research, how we're going to do it, conducting the research, analyzing it, and this is how we're going to use it, how we're going to apply it. And there's also a really strong focus on action, that something is going to change, and ideally something's going to be improved because of this research project. So I was also taking a lot of classes in the School of Public Health, because public health uses participatory action research. And if you looked at the resources that I sent to the class before this, the YouTube video was done by Kaiser Permanente, and they took this method and Kaiser Permanente is one of the largest health organizations in the US, and they took photo voice and method and are now using it in lots of different communities to have community members tell them, this is what well-being means to us. This is what we care about in terms of having a good quality of life. So photo voice was started by these two women working for the Ford Foundation, Caroline Wong and Marianne Burris, and they gave cameras to women in rural China to document things that they saw as being problems in their lives. And then, like having to get all of your water from these sort of polluted, hand-dug wells. And then they would have, the women who were taking the pictures would come together on a regular basis with local policymakers and people from the Ford Foundation, the folks who had the bucks. And those three groups would sit together and they would talk about, okay, these are the problems that we see in our communities, and they would come up with ways to address them. So the women were doing the research, they were taking photos, images, then they were coming together and they were explaining, using narrative and interviews, what was why they saw that to be a problem. And then coming up with with solutions. And one of the things that I didn't mention that I should have is that participatory action research evolved a lot from work that was being done in international development in the global south. Because often what was happening was that scientists and conservationists were going into these communities, or development workers were going into these communities, and they were saying, this is what we think your problem is, and this is how we think you should solve your problem. And the local people would be really polite and say, yeah, 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 but it didn't reflect the suggestions, the recommendations didn't reflect their reality. So then the conservationists or whoever would leave, and they wouldn't adopt the practices because the two sides were not talking to each other. So an example of that might be like conservationists trying to set up a program around elephant poaching and not communicating with the local people and finding out that the elephants are destroying the fields where they're getting their livelihood and feeding their kids, which seems like a really kind of duh thing, but it happened back then. So, so going back to China and photo voice, so they would create these solutions, and then, so this is like a cleaner, more efficient well that's enclosed. And then one of the things that I thought was really cool was that the women kept the cameras and they would go to evaluate the projects, the interventions, and then they would all come together again and talk about how it went. So it was really focused on qualities, not just how many people were using these interventions, but how did it work? Why did it work? Why weren't people doing it? I'm not sure what I was going to ask you there, but maybe I was going to ask you if you have ever heard of the spotted owl. Please raise your hand if you've heard of the spotted owl controversy. Wow, not many of you. Okay, so in the 1990s, there was this huge debate going on in the US, and particularly in the Pacific Northwest. And it was being framed as a battle between loggers and environmentalists. And the problem was that the loggers who were, making their livelihood off of cutting down trees wanted to be able to cut down old growth trees. But the environmentalists, and that was the only habitat for the spotted owl, which was an endangered species. So the environmentalists were saying, if you cut these trees, not only will we lose the only habitat for this really beautiful and special bird, but we're going to lose all of the other ecological functions and services that old growth forests provide. And it was really, really bitter, heated. I mean, people were like carrying guns, and it got violent and ugly. So this woman named Beverly Brown started doing oral histories with people in these counties in southwestern Oregon where this was going on. And she talked to people from all over the area in all different kind of walks of life. But what she found out from taking the time to do these open-ended, in-depth oral histories with people and going, back 20, 30 years, was that she uncovered that the tensions that were going on around this were much more complicated than just logging jobs versus saving this habitat. That underneath it, there were a lot of animosity on the part of the people who had lived in those communities about government regulations and how they had been managing federal lands. They were also really unhappy. There was a lot of sort of class conflict around people from Northern California who were moving to Southern Oregon and taking over lands that people used to be able to just hunt and fish on, and all of these sort of other things going on economically and politically that were making the people in the logging community feel sort of squeezed, like they didn't have a lot of options. And so the lesson for me when I encountered this book was that it's really important to do qualitative research, to understand sort of the whole context in which a lot of these environmental dilemmas are situated. So, and another thing, I don't know if any of you have taken anthropology, you might have come across the terms emic versus etic. And emic just means that whoever is dealing with the issue, that's their insider's perspective, and etic is the outsider looking at that perspective. So in the spotted owl case, the emic perspective would be the perspective of the people who lived in those communities, and the etic might be, the New York Times and the media that's putting their spin on the story. But when you put the etic and the emic together, you have a much more powerful lens for understanding what's going on. Okay, so I've been talking for a really long time, and I want to give you guys a chance to interact. So do you have any questions or thoughts about any of the stuff that I've talked about so far?
Out of curiosity, there's a lot of really great science out there. How much is this actually happening in terms of applying regulations to? There's a reason why Donald Trump became president. A lot of people felt like they weren't being listened to. I'm just wondering how much is what you do for work actually being felt out and being performed around the world and even in the United States. Sorry, my name is Sarah.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. A lot, yeah. And I think in my, career, I've seen a shift to, particularly in some social sciences and policy, folks who are looking at policy, to including more qualitative work. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily get into the media, because that's a whole nother story about what we see and what we're aware of, but through public media, but there is a lot of it going on, particularly in health and international development and policy work, I think, yeah. Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna take a drink of water and keep going. Okay, so just very briefly, the methods that we use for qualitative research rely on open-ended questions, and that can include surveys that are using open-ended questions so that you can get that insider's perspective so they can explain what they think is going on. Interviews, oral histories, focus groups, observation, so participant observation or direct observation, ethnography, a lot of the stuff that anthropologists do. When I say explanatory illustrations here, this is a picture of a tool that's used a lot in the global south and developing countries, but it can be used in any circumstances, where you ask people in the community to draw a map of how they perceive the community, what's important to them, and then you have them talk about it and give you explanations. Or you can have them, walk down a street with you or walk a transect someplace and explain to you what's important. Or do ranking exercises. So that's sort of why I'm saying explanatory illustrations. I don't have a better word for that. And then content analysis is when you look at the content of documents or social media or videos, and then you use the methods that people use for analyzing qualitative research to see what kind of trends and patterns and what you can learn from that. And I'm not going to say more about that because you could have a course for an entire semester on qualitative methods. But the gist of what I want you to kind of get is that usually with qualitative research, you have small sample sizes, just a few people or maybe individual cases. So it's not very generalizable. But because it's narrative, people are explaining to you what they think is going on, you can start to get at these how and why questions. And this cartoon kind of illustrates this. So, this person over here is saying, let's see a show of hands. Who here prefers quantitative data over qualitative data? And he counts 1, 2, 3. Okay, looks like everybody. Tell me, why do you prefer quantitative? And they say, and somebody starts to speak using words, and he says, oh, sorry, I should have mentioned, please only use numbers in your response. So we can get a lot more, we can understand, if we're using qualitative, we can understand context, history, motivations, meaning, values. So this is just a really abbreviated list of why some folks use qualitative research for developing policy or programs, creating or evaluating interventions in legal disputes. One of the resources I gave you for homework talks about a coal incident where it was used in legal issues. And then if you're interested in using qualitative research, who might you be employed by? Nonprofits, the government, other policymakers, think tanks. You can do education, particularly like in international development, and then social and political science, which there are a lot of consulting firms now that do what they call mixed methods. They combine both quantitative and qualitative. So I think I'm just going to very quickly give you a few examples of how I've used qualitative research in my career. So for my master's work, a Nicaraguan colleague and I trained youth in a Nicaraguan village to interview seniors about how natural resources had changed over time. And the reason why we chose to do that is because there were a lot of economic development and natural resource conservation organizations in that area at the time of the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, and they were just going in and telling people, this is what we think you should do. So we did this project because we both wanted to, understand what the people in the village, what their priorities were, what their level of knowledge was, and the community advisors that we were working with told us that they wanted us to have the kids involved in the research. So then I spent a number of years doing similar cross-generational research projects in different parts of the country. This is in northern Maine, and we did this project because they were interested, it was in very northern Maine on the Canadian border, and they were interested in increasing tourism there, but they wanted to do it in a way that was sensitive to local culture. And so they asked me to come in and do a project where I was training the kids to talk with seniors in the community about how to celebrate local culture, ideas around tourism that could be based in their natural resources, most of which were around the St. Johns River, which also had an endangered species. Then I did my dissertation, and that was during when there was a lot of controversy around genetically modified seeds. There was a big push to do genetically modified vegetables, and there was this thing called Terminator technology. Have any of you heard of Terminator technology? Okay, so it was basically that these companies were making it so that you could not save seed. You could save it, but it would not be viable. And they were doing this all over the world. And so I started talking to folks in Vermont who were vegetable growers to find out why did they grow open pollinated seed that they could conserve. And so these are the hands of some of the people who I interviewed and some of the seeds that they were saving. And in the end, some of the research that I worked on ended up getting in this book on trying to encourage genetic diversity in the US food system and make it really bioregional. Another project that we did was, were any of you guys around when the Localvore Challenge happened? We were trying to challenge people to eat locally as much as possible. And one of the big barriers that they found was that it was hard to get, aside from chocolate and coffee, beans, grains, and oils. And so a group of colleagues and I did interviews, and this was mixed methods. We did both quantitative and qualitative, but we were asking growers, buyers, processors, anybody in the food system who would be dealing with those products, greens, beans, and oils, about what would be the challenges and barriers to growing them commercially in Vermont and getting them into the market at a price that could be cost effective for farmers. And Jack Laser was one of the people who was involved with that. And I also worked on a study. I was asked by a group of funders. This is when we were just beginning to try to understand Vermont's local food system. And so I was contracted with some funders to get a sense of all of the different nonprofits that were doing work in Vermont on local food systems, and how could they collaborate better together to leverage their work together. And there were a lot of people who were working on this at the time, so I don't want to say that I was pivotal to Farm to Plate. I was one of many people who we then ended up with this 10-year project called Farm to Plate, which is a 10-year strategy to increase the consumption of local food in Vermont and boost our agricultural industry. And then the last one I'm including because this had a policy implication. I did the interviews for this. These are two other social scientists at UVM and at USDA. They hired me to do interviews with people who were foraging plants for either arts and crafts or for food on the Green Mountain National Forest or the Finger Lakes National Forest. And the reason why we were doing that is because the National Forest was looking at changing their policies. So they wanted to ask the people who are using the forests for income and livelihood or to help feed their families, what their opinions would be about these changes and how it would impact them. So, I've still got 15 minutes.
No, you've got half an hour.
I've got, okay. Well, I want to give 15 minutes for discussion, so I have 15 minutes to talk. Thank you. So, questions? Yes.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth, and speaking of the local food, how did they do it back in the day where all every family grew their own food and had like all these spices or whatever they did, and now it's an issue? Why is it an issue now that it wasn't really then?
Wow. That could be a whole big class. And I'm trying to figure out, does anyone want to take a stab at condensing that? I think there was a big shift. There were a lot of different things that came into it. So one of them was industrialization and urbanization. So when people were feeding their own families, they were mostly living in rural areas and raising their own food. So with industrialization and more jobs in other places, people were leaving the countryside. And then there was also the development of a whole bunch of new technologies which allowed us to preserve food, and supermarkets came in. So it was, as people were moving to the cities and changing their jobs, they changed how they accessed food. So that's a very oversimplified response. Yeah.
To add to that, I also found back then people used to eat with the seasons. So you didn't eat eggs in the winter because your chickens weren't laying. All your oils were gotten because you rendered your animals fat down and got your oil that way. You ate meat and root vegetables for the winter, and then you ate your greens during the summer. So even food preferences shifted as part of that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I just feel like it's almost like coming back around. Like, I'm originally not from Vermont, so that's why it's like amazing to see the buy local and everything.
Yeah.
But it just like, I feel like it's almost like coming back since I moved up here. I feel like more people are pushing to buy local than in the grocery store still.
Yeah.
And that's what just, it amazes me what's happening.
Yeah. Well, that could be a whole class or a semester's worth of class, and there's probably options here at Johnson for you to explore those questions. So, does anyone else have questions about the stuff that I was just talking about? So, if not, I'm going to jump into the work that I'm doing now.
Hi, Caitlin.
Oh, yeah, hi, Caitlin.
Where did you get your master's again?
So I got both. So I got my undergraduate degree was at University of Wisconsin in botany. And then my master's was at University of Michigan in the School of Natural Resources. And then I went back there for my dissertation. So I also got my Ph.D. at University of Michigan in natural resources.
Oh, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so now I work for University of Vermont Extension, and I worked for them for 6 years providing technical assistance to fruit and vegetable farmers. So totally radical change. But I worked for Extension because I really wanted to do applied work. I like being out in the world and helping people solve problems. So, and now I've switched and I work with the Urban and Community Forestry program, and I'm doing most of my work is on emerald ash borer. Raise your hand if you've heard of emerald ash borer. All right, a few more of you need to hear about it. But so I do a little bit of qualitative research in that position. I'm doing some case studies with communities in the Midwest. I'm doing a project with women forest owners, but I'm still not like getting enough of it because it's what I really, really love to do. So I thought, how can I do more oral histories? And I'm also really passionate about trash and figuring out how we can produce less trash and have people be more sensitive to all of the stuff that we throw out. So the Library of Congress has a fellowship. They have this project called Occupational Folklife. And what they want to do is document what jobs are like, so that we have these kind of thick, detailed descriptions so that anybody doing research now can go there and get a great oral history. They can listen to the audio and see all of these photographs of what somebody's job is like, whether they're a hair cutter or a horse race trainer or a ship's captain or a trucker or he's an iron worker. And that information will stay there, and it will be available so that people 100, 200 years ago from now, as long as the technology stands up, can go back and see what those jobs were like. So I proposed to them that and they have these fellowships that they pay people to do these oral histories. So I applied for one of those fellowships. So it's kind of like a second job. And I wanted to do it on trash. And I made a few different arguments for why this was a relevant and valuable project. Now, have any of you heard about what's going on with China and trash from the US?
Yeah, they're not accepting it anymore.
Right. So we used to send, I shouldn't have said trash, I should have said recyclables, because a huge proportion of the recyclable material from the US used to go to China. And it's complicated because some of it has to do with China now has enough of their own materials that they don't need ours. But the other issue is that because most of the US has single stream, like you throw everything in one bin, that means that a lot of our recyclables are contaminated. They're not great quality. And so China said, you know what? We're not going to take your dirty trash, your dirty recyclables anymore. So what this picture is illustrating, these are all, things that could potentially be recycled, but they're not. A lot of the US has chosen to, so we're getting this backlog of all of these recyclable materials. People are continuing to put stuff in their recycling bins, and then they go off to the facility and they get baled, but then we're just sitting with all of these bales that either end up going to the landfill or they're getting incinerated. So that's a huge problem. Another reason why I made the pitch for this project as being relevant now is that solid waste management is actually a growing industry. This is a place where there is job growth in the US, and a lot of municipalities and larger cities are looking at it as a way to bring in jobs and economic development. So I was also really, I wanted to personally do this project because have any of you ever been to a materials recycling facility where they sort through the recyclables? Okay, not many. I would encourage all of you to go because it is a mind-blowing experience. I gave Dr. Kanat a link to a video that you can watch, but the video is nothing in comparison to actually going and experiencing it. And so I thought that if I collected oral histories and photographs from the people who are on the front line of handling the stuff that we throw out in our trash, in our recycling bins, that could maybe help people, consumers, be a little bit more thoughtful about what we throw out. So I also got some funding from the Vermont Farm to Plate project because they're doing this, these career profiles to show people what it is like to work in different careers in the food system. And Food waste is a huge percentage of our waste stream, and so figuring out how to deal with organic waste is important. And then you can't read this either, but the Food Cycle Coalition, which is the part of the Farm to Plate network that's responsible for helping the state figure out how to implement getting organics out of landfills, also gave me some resources to do this work. So I interviewed people in as many different sectors of the solid waste industry that I could. Everybody from guys who were, driving the garbage truck and, picking up your trash at your house, to people who were collecting compost and bringing it to compost facilities, to people who are collecting and consolidating hazardous waste, the chemicals and toxins that we throw out, people who are disassembling our cell phones and our laptops to take out the precious metals, people who worked in the materials recovery facility, picking through our cat food cans and diapers and everything else that gets mixed in with the recycling that doesn't belong there, and they stand there and do it all day long. So people who operate the trash compactors at the transfer stations. So I talked to all of these different people, and it was a phenomenal experience. So I'm just going to share a few slides from a few of those people with you to share some of the insights that came out of these conversations. So this is Paul Tomasi, and he is the director for the Northeast Kingdom Solid Waste District. And do you know what Johnson's Solid Waste District is? Does anyone know? Okay, there's some research for you to do.
I think most of Vermont nowadays is Casella, but I don't know about up here. I'm from further down south, and it's Casella.
Yeah, so Casella is a hauler. The state is divided up into solid waste districts, and those are municipalities, and they manage and coordinate the flow. So Casella hauls and Casella owns 2 of the material recovery facilities. Paul, that's a great segue. So Paul operates the solid waste district in the Northeast Kingdom, and they operate their own materials recovery facility. They don't have Casella do it. So he's standing in front of a hazardous waste collection site. This is what the inside looks like, just sort of a morning's worth of cardboard. One of the things, I apologize for these washed out photos, one of the things that makes the Northeast Kingdom Solid Waste District special. Did you?
Question, was this taken in Lindenville?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, yep.
I'm from Lindenville.
Do you
so
take your trash there?
I take my trash there, yeah.
Yeah.
Trash and recycling.
Yeah, so these guys are really cool. This is actually geographically the largest solid waste district in the state. They are huge in terms of the physical area that they cover, but it's really, really low population. But so what I was trying to show in this picture is these are all some of the different bins that people have to put their stuff in, because this solid waste district has always had its member communities segregate their paper from their glass, from their metals. So they end up with a much higher quality product, because it's not all thrown in together and all mushed in with diapers and cat food and old moldy yogurt that nobody's washed out. So, and then one of the other cool things that they do is when people throw out bicycles, they repair them and they make them available for free to kids in the community. So what I wanted to share with you is I asked Paul, and these are just like little snippets to give you a taste. I asked Paul if the China ban had affected them. And he says, it has, but not to the degree that it's affected some other facilities that rely on single stream. And I'll give you a perfect example. We get $45 a ton for our mixed paper, and some other facilities that are processing single stream mixed paper are paying $57 a ton. So that's receiving money versus having to pay somebody to take your stuff. So this is Gary Winnie, who I think is a total superhero. That he works for the Chittenden Solid Waste Department, and he heads their hazardous waste collection site, which is called the Enviro Depot. And Gary got into this when he was a young man. He was probably in his late 20s, because he wanted to do something good for the environment. So here's, you get big trucks with toxic chemicals, and then you get, mothers cleaning out somebody's house with a bunch of, cleaning fluids and stuff. And this is a really long quote, and I'm not going to read it all to you, but the point that Gary is making, I've got two things that I want to share with you that Gary shared. One is that, so you bring your hazardous waste to this facility, and they go through it all, and they say what things can go together, what chemicals can go together, what is like, and they group them in like categories, and then they consolidate them. And those things either go to graves, they're literally called graves, in Texas and Oklahoma and other parts of the country, and they're buried in their containers. And that's it. And that's mostly what happens with pesticides. Anything that can be used as a fuel, whether it's like mineral oil, baby oil, furniture polish, suntan lotion, any petrochemical-based thing that could be used as a fuel that has BTU value, that can go in another drum. And then I wanted to get a picture of this, and I just didn't have time to snag it. But they have these tank farms, like especially in New Jersey, there are ones in Massachusetts, where they put all of these things, and then they burn hazardous waste for industrial fuel. So I thought that was fascinating. And here's this guy who's super devoted to taking care of the environment and protecting these toxins from getting into the environment. He's been doing it for 27 years. And I was like, so Gary, what are the risks to your health? And, okay, so he says he's done this for 27 years, he's 60. They don't worry too much about the acute exposures, the explosions, those happen, but they've got a lot of protections against it. But what they don't know about is the chronic exposure of the synergistic effect. Nobody can really tell you what combining acetone and gasoline and naphtha and toluene and mineral spirits and suntan lotion and cooking oil and being exposed to all of that at the same time is going to do in the long run.
Don't they wear respirators?
They do.
Okay.
They do. They wear respirators. So yeah, they wear respirators, they wear suits, they wear all kinds of stuff. But still, he's been doing this for 27 years, and we just don't have the science that is looking at these cumulative effects. So the last person I'm going to talk about is Trevor Mance, who, when he was 19 years old, when he was 16 years old, his mom said, you got to get a summer job. So he went to the transfer station and he started helping the recycling at the transfer station. And then when he was 19, he bought somebody's trash route. There was a guy who had a trash route who was retiring. He bought the guy's truck and his trash route. And now, he's in his 30s, 16 years later, he's composting, got a major composting operation that takes all of the money that's shredded in the US goes into his compost operation. Because there's only one company in Deerfield, Massachusetts that prints US money. And so everything they shred goes to this compost here in Shaftesbury. So the other thing that Trevor did was he started his own materials recovering facility. And so these are some of the guys working on the sorting line, going through our dirty recyclables and figuring out what can get recycled and what has to go back into the trash in the landfill. And so, again, not to take a lot of time on this, basically, this is a story about how he went from, being this kid who was getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to drive this trash route before he went to school, to college in the evening, to now he has a compost facility, a transfer station, and a materials recovery facility in Pownell. Are any of you from Bennington County? Yeah. Do you know Tam?
Yeah. They
Yeah.
send out Christmas cards.
Yeah. Yeah. So would you say that Pownell could use some jobs?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So he has created a business that employs 70 people now in an area of the state that can really use good jobs with benefits and health care. He actually, I just found out, made an arrangement with, it'll stay Tam, but he just made an arrangement with Casella. So wrapping things up, what I am hoping to do with the oral histories that I've done with folks around Trash Talk and the photographs that I've taken is I want to use the content of this qualitative research for education. I'm looking for funding to create an exhibit that can travel around to libraries in the state of Vermont and then work with the children's librarians. I think the photos and the quotes are for adults in the community, but then I'd love to work with children's librarians to develop activities around how do we deal with all of the stuff that we're throwing out, and how can we be more mindful about that. And I also have this fantasy of working, do you guys know about the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction? So, something else for you to research. In Vermont, we have a college that teaches people to be cartoonists called the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction. And I want to do a pitch there, and because I think that these people, one of the photographs that I left out that I wish that I had put in there is by this guy named Alec, or of this guy named Alec. And what Alec does all day is he power steams totes that have been collecting rotten food from restaurants that go to compost facilities. So I have these pictures of Alex with standing on a cold winter's day, fully dressed in rubber with maggots getting backsplashed into his face. And I think these people are superheroes. So, so with that, the take-home lessons that I would like, that I'm hoping that you will leave with, are that you're able to find work that you're both motivated by, but that also builds on your strengths, that you figure out what you do well and comes easily to you, and that you also find out what it is that makes you want to get out of bed in the morning. And that's going to be different for everybody. Sometimes it might be you really want to work in a team, you're a very social person. Sometimes maybe it means you have to have the financial security. For me, it was doing work that was in alignment with my values. I also want you to remember that qualitative research can be a really powerful tool in your toolbox as a scientist and wanting to understand the world. And now a lot of employers are looking for people who can do mixed methods. So take your statistics courses, but also maybe learn a little bit about qualitative research methods. And then finally, don't put lithium batteries in your recycling because it's really, really dangerous.
Really, really dangerous.
Really, really dangerous. So that's, so I'm gonna send Dr. Kanat a slide with all the credits, and then I just need to acknowledge the Library of Congress Archie Green Fellowship for their support of Trash Talk. So that's it, and I apologize, we only have maybe like 5 minutes for conversation, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about all of this.
Hi, I'm Melissa. I have a question about how much of an impact does the big waves on the farmers now with like seeds and what kind of seeds they can get and GMO thing and because I know there's a lot of underlying what we don't see from the outside of how they're trying to businesses like farming, small family farms are just struggling because of all of the bigger corporations trying to mandate everything. How much of an impact is just getting viral seeds?
Yeah. So it depends a certain amount on whether you're talking what level of agriculture you're talking about, and if you're talking about seeds for grain production for animal feed or seeds for commodity crops like soybeans or whatever, or seeds just for home gardening. There's, in the larger commodity crops and the grain, it's pretty much 2 companies now that own most of that, and they're subsidiaries. So they are owning those genes on the larger commercial scale. On the, we still have more diversity for seeds for like home gardeners, and then definitely in the global south, there's the large monopolies have made a lot of incursions because they are encouraging peasant farmers to use their hybrid varieties and varieties that are dependent on things like Roundup Ready, but there are still small-scale farmers that are saving seed, and people who are encouraging them to do that. I haven't done that work for a few years, but the last I heard, they had kind of given up the idea of Terminator technology. So I'm not sure where that is yet.
I know there's a fine line with what you can actually call organic, and a lot of farmers are getting sued because of even a bee pollinating on a non-organic food.
Yeah, or because of wind.
Right.
Often the wind would be a real problem with contamination. Yeah. Other ideas, feedback.
It was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have one question, Les Kanat. So, qualitative research, doesn't that require some quantitative skills? Like, it's not just summarizing what people say, isn't it? Don't you have to quantify, like, how many people think a certain way?
Yes, sometimes. So I didn't feel like I had enough time to get into the different modes of analysis. You can, and people often do, what they'll do is they'll take the qualitative content and they will count how many people have given certain responses. They'll categorize it. Often, if you're working with narrative text, it's called coding. Or even if you're working with images, you can code the images in certain categories. So you would say, and then you usually try to, like in terms of sample sizes, you do it until you get saturation, until you have so many people saying it over and over again. You're not getting new and different responses. But yes, you'll often, after you've done the analysis, turn it into a numerical statement about a certain percentage of people felt this way. Yeah.
We can talk more at dinner. Thank you very much.
Okay.